landlord's going to be paying for their housing. So if somebody has a voucher, like Section 8, something like that, they can't be flat out denied just because they have that voucher. Or if somebody's income is Social Security or something like that, again, they can't be told, we don't allow people here who only have Social Security as their income. Does that make sense? So in the Fair Housing Act, it spells out a number of things that landlords can't do, shouldn't be doing, and that's what these are. So I'm going to kind of just go through them quickly. And the first one is refusing to negotiate for housing. And the way that I like to look at this one is somebody doesn't even get their foot in the door. They don't even have a chance to talk to a landlord or a property manager about an apartment. So, maybe there's a property owner and they want really tight control about tenants who are going in, and so they only take word of mouth referrals, and that's a really easy way to screen out some of those protected classes. Some other examples might be, and we hear this quite a bit actually, people who are deaf using a relay, so they'll call into the relay service and they'll be signing to the operator there, and then that operator then places a phone call for them. And so when the landlord answers the phone, the relay operator identifies himself as an operator that they're going to be translating, and they're hung up on. So that person who is deaf using the relay service never even gets through to the landlord or property manager to have that conversation. The next one is refusing to rent or sell. And there can be a lot of overlap in these. This one might be that we don't rent to people like you. That doesn't, we don't hear that said very often anymore. For the most part, most people know that they can't say that to someone, but it does happen. But it might happen in other ways, allowing somebody to apply for an apartment, but never having the intention of renting to them might be another example of that. Making housing unavailable. So in these situations, there's a unit that's open, it's ready to go, but somebody in one of those protected classes goes out and inquires about it, and they're told, sorry, we just rented it out, it's not available anymore. But like I said, the reality is it's there, and the landlord just lied to that person about its availability. The next one is denying a dwelling. So this could happen somewhere or anywhere along the application process. And again, it can kind of manifest in a number of different ways. You might see a situation where there is an interracial couple and the white partner goes out and has a conversation with the landlord and everything goes great. They're given an application, they're invited to apply, and that person goes home, and they sit down with their partner who's black, they fill out the application, and they go to turn it in together, and then the owner sees that their partner's black, and they're thinking, I don't want these people in here now, takes the application and then denies it. We see that sometimes also families with kids, or even if maybe one of the children has a disability, and there might be some behavioral manifestations, and the landlord or the owner sees that, and again they're thinking, I don't want these people in my apartment, and they deny the application. The next one is falsely denying that housing is available for inspection. This is kind of similar to making it unavailable, but it's kind of a normal thing for someone to want to look at an apartment before they move in or apply or sign a lease. And so in these situations, this is where a landlord or owner is just not letting somebody inspect it or view it, but they're letting other people view it. So someone who's in one of those protected classes might hear something like, I'm sorry I can't let you in because it's being cleaned right now, or the previous tenant still has some of their belongings in there, and I don't want to disturb it or disturb them. And those things are okay if it's true, but if they're using that as an excuse to not let them look at the apartment, then that's a problem. The next one is denying access to a facility or service related to the housing. So this could mean physical accessibility, you know, if there are common areas, and especially if the apartment was built after 1991, there should be certain amounts of accessibility, physical accessibility. But it also can relate to things like, you know, if there's a laundry room on site, or a common area, a property owner can't deny access to that to certain groups of people. So, you know, there might be a number of singles living in an apartment, and there's a swimming pool, and they don't want to be disturbed by families. But a landlord can't say to a family just categorically, you can't use the swimming pool because you're a family. Yeah.
If you have somebody that is interested in renting a unit, and you try to talk with them and they speak Spanish and you can't understand, you have somebody that's translating, who are you renting to? The one that first asked you think will be in there, or do you draw lines? You can't communicate with them?
So I think as you're receiving the application, so if you have somebody with a complete application and they qualify, you know, and you make a stack of applications you're receiving and you're going down through it, you should be taking the first qualified person. But I mean, if you do have someone who can't fill out the application and turn that in, you know, I wouldn't say that you're discriminating against them in that situation. You know, if you're doing things to kind of impede them with filling out the application, then that might be a problem. But if they, you know,
Even if you don't have an application form, and they're just looking at the apartment, they answered the ad or whatever, and you meet them there, and you're trying to communicate with them, and you can't, is there discrimination?
You know, I would say just try to do what you would do with anyone else. Try to communicate with them, offer them an application if that's what you would do to anyone else who was coming in. You know, if you make your best effort, you know, that's what you can do. And just because somebody doesn't speak English, that doesn't mean you have to
get a translator, or
right, make special exceptions for them. So
okay.
The next one on here is setting different terms, fees, or conditions. A lot of times this will manifest financially. So an owner or landlord can't charge different groups of people different rents. For example, you know, if there's an apartment that's advertised for $700 and I go and apply for it, it's a white male, and that's what the price is for me. A Hispanic person goes out and they apply for it, but the rent's $800 for them. You know, that's an example of setting different conditions. Higher deposits for different groups of people. You can have a policy that if somebody's credit doesn't meet a certain standard, you could charge them a higher deposit. But again, just to categorically charge higher deposits or higher rents to these protected classes for no other reason is a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Yeah?
So maybe this is a silly question. If someone wants to be able to rent it, but they need a ramp built, can we charge the price of the ramp to
I'm going to talk about modifications in a couple of minutes,
right.
And I'll see if I answer your question, and if I don't, raise your hand again.
Okay.
Is that all right? Okay. Yeah.
So if a person needed to have a service dog, and so you've got the service dog,
Yeah.
you know, but normally you don't allow pets in your house. You've had real problems with pets destroying houses and yards and stuff. But we cannot charge like a different deposit fee because potentially that pet could again destroy the house and the
Right.
yard and everything, right?
Yeah, we always have the most questions on assistance animals,
Uh-huh.
and I have a little section on that.
Oh, okay,
So
sorry.
I save the best for last, I
Okay.
suppose.
But that would fit
That's
kind
the
of.
most important thing, so we want
I know.
lots of time for that.
I hold that over you so you listen to all of this
But
other
it would
stuff.
kind of
before I
fit
get
in
to it.
that area that you're talking about, civic service.
Yeah, a little bit. So, I mean, that would be an example of, charging someone a higher amount because they're in a protected class. And so, yeah, that would fall under that category, so yes. But it's a little bit different for accommodations because those are additional protections that people with disabilities have, and I'll go over that. So the last one of these things that landlords can't do is called steering. And so this can manifest in a number of ways as well. And the first one is what people might think of as segregation. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that term. From the 60s, there was a lot of segregation throughout neighborhoods. But that still happens today. And so in a situation like that, you might have one person, say an African American, they go to apply in a neighborhood that's predominantly white, and the owner doesn't want this black person living in their neighborhood, in their apartment, and so they're referred to another apartment on the other side of town. So that's throughout the communities. You can also see this within an apartment complex, and we've seen this before. Sometimes owners might want to separate people out into different buildings. So everyone with a disability in one building, everyone who's a refugee from one particular country in another building, Hispanics in another building. And then the last example we have, you can even see this within a building. A lot of times families with children are steered towards basement apartments. Because kids are loud, and the thinking there is, I want to put this family in the basement so the kids aren't disturbing the neighbors above and below. And so if a family with children wants to live in a basement apartment, that's okay. Or if one of those groups of people want to live together in a building or a certain area, that's okay. The problem is when they're not given that choice. They're kind of forced into those apartments or forced into those buildings without having the option of living in a different unit or a different building. So these are the kind of no-nos that we look for. So I kind of want to just briefly talk about what types of housing are covered under the Fair Housing Act. So most types of housing are covered. The way that we really look at this is if there is a building with 4 or more units, it's definitely it's covered by the Fair Housing Act. So 4plexes on up to large 100-unit complexes, they're all covered. So if you own one of those or manage one of those, you have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. If it's a duplex, that's an exemption. If it's a triplex, it's an exemption. Or if it's a 4plex and the owner lives in it, it's also exempted. And how I like to look at it is, even though there are 4 units in that building, they're only renting 3 of those. So it's kind of not over that number of 4 for the threshold, so it's exempt. Single family homes are exempt unless someone is using a broker or a property management company, then they also have to follow the Fair Housing Act. So if I own a home here in Salt Lake, I have another one down in Arizona, and I'm renting it out, and I'm using a property management company, they still have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. But if I'm just renting it out on my own, they don't. Does that make sense?
If you have no more than 3 units. But if you have 4 houses in the valley, you're still covered, right? You still have to comply.
And that's another thing. If it's a duplex, if it's a single duplex, it's exempt. But if I own 10 duplexes or 10 single family homes, that's kind of a different situation because I'm kind of in the business of offering housing to people, so I would still have to comply. Yeah.
Are you exempt if you have, say, 6 properties, but you hold 3 of them in two different entities?
No. No. That's a good try. But no. So when we do an investigation, when the state does an investigation, we do ownership searches and we try to tease out exactly how many properties people own or how they're tied to those properties. So.
So it's per state, right? It's per state. No?
No.
You're
I
doing
mean, this-
all states
So
now?
this is a federal law. So this is a federal law. And, we've actually done some investigations of some apartment complexes here that are owned by entities in other states who also own properties in other states. And, it looks to us like they're violating the act here as well as in other states. And so it really doesn't matter what state it's in because this is federal law. Unless it's source of income, and that's, like I said, just here in Utah.
But I'm saying, if you're four, because it used to be, I thought, that if your three were here and you had some in another state, you still were exempt if you owned them. Is that not the case?
I don't believe it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you have a house, I'm referring to the wheelchair access and such, it's not handicapped accessible.
Right.
So you would be exempt, correct?
Yeah,
Not
but it's
only
just,
do you have to get in, you have to get around inside.
If
And
it's
the house
just
wasn't
a-
built that way.
if it's just a single family, if
But how
it's
about
just,
if you have 5 single families?
yes. If you have 5 single family homes that you're renting out,
But each single family it's not required to make it I don't know of any rule says if you have a house, it has to be accessible.
no,
Apartment, yes.
right, you're
So I'm
right.
saying, how do you make that accessible?
And so this is where it will go into the modification question,
Okay.
and it'll be my next slide. I think my next slide. So for people with disabilities, they are also given a couple of additional protections. And so like you said with apartments, buildings that have been built after March 13, 1991 have to meet accessibility standards. And so they should be accessible. If it's older than that, again, it's kind of a different situation that will relate to asking for a modification. But this is the definition of disability according to the Fair Housing Act. So, yeah.
Sorry, just, does it use ADA as the definition, or is it specifically defined here?
It's specifically defined here.
Because it's the same.
Yeah, no, yes, it's right.
Fine, I was just curious.
But yeah, they're two different acts.
Right.
They have their own language. But yeah, there are definitely similarities. So a person has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one of their major life activities. So that could be seeing, hearing, walking, breathing, learning, speaking, taking care of oneself, or performing daily tasks. They're regarded as having such an impairment. And so what that means is if somebody's looking for an apartment and a landlord thinks they have a disability, they're perceived as having a disability, and they're discriminated against, that's against the law, even if they don't. And right here it says if they have a record of having such an impairment, so if somebody has had a history of having symptoms related to a disability, even though they might not be exhibiting them today, if they have a record of that, they can't be discriminated against because they have a record of that. So this is the definition of disability. And so with accommodations and modifications that I'm going to be talking about in a second, the very first thing, the very first criteria for someone to be able to ask for a modification or an accommodation is they fit this definition. So they have to have a disability to be able to ask for these things. So I've kind of alluded to this. So these are the two additional protections that people with disabilities have. So they have the right to ask for a reasonable accommodation, and they have the right to ask for a reasonable modification. And does anybody know the difference between a modification and accommodation?
Generally, modifications don't cost you anything. Reasonable accommodation generally costs the person that's requesting it something.
I think it's the other way.
Yeah, it's actually the other way.
Accommodation means you allow them
Oh, is
to
it the other
be
way around?
accommodated,
Okay.
but if you have to modify your home or make major modifications to do that, then that would be.
Yeah. So a modification is a physical or structural change, and an accommodation is an exception to a rule or a policy. So obviously, if you're going to be making physical changes to the unit or premises, that's where it's going to cost more money. Again, so the first criteria for someone being able to ask for a modification is that they have a disability, and they have to show that there's a relationship between what they're asking for and their disability, and there has to be, like I said, a connection and a reason for them to be asking for this to help them to be able to use or enjoy their unit. And so, you know, if someone's in a wheelchair and they want counters that are lowered, there's kind of an obvious connection there, I think, because their chair is lower to the ground, the counters are lower to be able to go up. But, you know, if I have a disability, and let's say, you know, I have PTSD or depression or something like that, and I ask for my counters to be lowered, there's maybe not a connection between my mental illness there and me asking for those counters to be lowered. So there has to be a connection between the disability and what they're asking for. So some examples of modifications would be ramps, grab bars in bathrooms for somebody who has a mobility impairment, a viewer on a door being lowered for someone who's in a wheelchair, someone who's deaf or hard of hearing asking for smoke detectors or a doorbell with a strobe on it because they can't hear an alarm going off, so they want someone to see it. So again, those are something that would be physically changing the premises.
It's that they have to they have to bring up the, you know, in the wheelchair access. I think that they have to pay for it, not an owner have to pay for it.
Exactly.
And after they moving out, they have to put it back in the house. Okay.
Yeah, no, you're right. And so, so when we're talking modifications, the owner has to say yes, it's okay. But we usually tell tenants and people that we're talking to who have disabilities that they should expect to pay for it. A property owner property owner would be expected to pay if they're receiving federal funding. And so that would mean funding that's tied to that complex or property, like HAME funds or some other type of project like that. If that's a situation, the owner would have to pay for it. But if it's a private owner who's not receiving any federal funding like that or money from HUD, then it's the responsibility of the tenant to pay for it. And then, like you said, if the landlord wants, they can have the tenant restore that unit to its original condition when they move out. You know, and so if they make big changes like put in a ramp or lower counters, they would have to pay to have that put back if you gave them permission to do it.
How does that work with Section 8 housing?
If someone has a Section 8 voucher. So a Section 8 voucher, it's federal money. However, it's tied to the person. So I'm the one, as a tenant, who is receiving Section 8. So it's my voucher. So I'm using that voucher to go find a place to live. And so that voucher is tied to me, not the property. So if it's a person who's receiving Section 8 and they're living in one of your units, that doesn't mean that you're receiving federal funding because it's that person's funding, not yours.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on this? We've seen a lot of times that if somebody is asking for grab bars or things like that, and then they move out, if they've made changes to that unit, a lot of times it can benefit the owner to then be able to say you have certain accessibility features. So a lot of times the owners don't necessarily make the tenants restore those things, but again, you have the right to ask them to do that. So reasonable accommodations. Like I said, an accommodation is an exception to a rule or policy. And the criteria for asking for an accommodation is the same as a modification. The person has to have a disability. They have to have a connection between what they're asking for and their disability. Again, I can't ask for something, an exception to a rule, if it's not directly related to my disability and me being able to use my apartment. Some examples of accommodations would be somebody who was blind requests that correspondence be given to them electronically. It's like copies of rules or leases emailed to them because they can't see, but they might have software that can read it back to them. Somebody who has a disability might be receiving Social Security, and rent is due on the 1st of the month. They don't get their check until the 3rd or the 5th of the month. And the policy is you pay your rent on the 1st, and if you don't, you're charged a late fee every day. So that person might be able to say, hey, I have a disability, I don't get paid until the 3rd, but your rule is I have to pay on the 1st, so can I have an exception to that and pay on the 3rd? So that's another example. And then the biggest example of accommodations are assistance animals, which I'll get to shortly. If you'll notice, in front of accommodation and modification, there was a word reasonable. And that's really important, especially on your end. If somebody's asking for something and it's going to impose an undue financial burden on you, then it's maybe not that reasonable for you to implement that. And you can tell them no. Also, if it's going to fundamentally alter the nature of your operations, you can also tell them no. What does that mean? It maybe depends. And so the determination about what's reasonable needs to be made on a case-by-case basis instead of just as a blanket policy or statement. So every person's disability is different. What they might need is different. So how you would handle that would be different. So making a request, a tenant has to actually ask you for a modification or accommodation. They just can't assume that it's okay. They just can't assume because they have a disability and they're in a wheelchair, they can start busting up your cabinets to install lower ones. They can't do that. Or they can't assume that they can move their assistance animal in because they have the right to that. They actually have to ask, they have to have that conversation with you. The request can be made in any manner, so verbally, in writing, over email. We always suggest that people do it in writing, so there's a copy and documentation of that. The request can be made at any time, so if somebody is looking to apply, they can bring it up then. They can bring it up after they move into the apartment. They can bring it up at any point in time. And the request can also be made by the person or a representative for that person. So if they have a family member that's helping them out, that family member can ask for the accommodation request, or a caseworker. So if there's somebody who knows the tenant, knows what they need, and knows the tenant wants assistance with that, they can also ask for that for them. As a housing provider, you can ask for verification. If somebody has an obvious disability, you shouldn't really need to have to ask for it. For example, if someone's in a wheelchair and they're asking for a ramp, then it's probably pretty obvious why they're asking for the rent. Or if somebody is blind and have a seeing eye dog, and they're asking if they can have their dog there, it's probably pretty obvious why they need their dog. So in those situations, you shouldn't be asking for verification, but if somebody's disability isn't obvious like that, you can ask for verification. When you're asking for verification, you can't ask for confidential information. So they have a right to privacy. So you shouldn't be asking prying questions about what's wrong with you, or asking people to sign HIPAA releases so you can look at their medical records. That's a bit too invasive. But verification can come from a number of different sources. It can come from a medical doctor, but it doesn't have to. It can come from a psychiatrist or psychologist, a caseworker, someone who's working at an agency that tenant is having an involvement with, or someone who's familiar with that person's situation. We've seen situations where there's maybe a parent helping their 20-something-year-old child find an apartment, and they've grown up with a disability, and so their mom knows really well their child has a disability and what they need. So some situations we've seen that it's been okay for family members to write verification letters. Assistance animals. It's kind of a special subset of accommodation requests. Assistance animals have been shown to be very effective in alleviating symptoms for a lot of different disabilities. The Fair Housing Act, as well as the Section 4 of the Rehabilitation Act, say that people with disabilities have a right to have assistance animals in their housing. Assistance animals are not pets. We don't look at them as pets, but we look at them as being assistance aids, like a wheelchair. And assistance animals don't require any specialized training. It also doesn't stipulate what type of animal it has to be. So in the Fair Housing Act, the definition is much more broad than in the ADA. The ADA is referring to public places. The animal has to be a dog or a miniature horse with specialized training. But in the Fair Housing Act, it could be any type of animal, and it doesn't have to have a specialized training.
And why is that? Because that's become a real problem. I mean, real service animals are highly trained. These assistance animals, they're using pit bulls that have had records of violence. There's all kinds of issues with it.
Right.
We've had to do recently in the industry, we had to certify 2 chickens as service animals, a great big boa constrictor snake that people are terrified of. It's out of control.
So with regards to the animals, the idea is, so again, with the ADA, that's public places. This should be in somebody's residence. So if they do have a snake, it should be in their house and not out around in common areas, things like that. Same thing with the
You
dog.
laugh, but it's not
true.
funny.
No,
It's here.
No.
What happens when the snake gets out? Do you accept responsibility for that snake?
How does a snake qualify?
Because
It gives them comfort.
they do, unfortunately. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what kind of animal, but it's so out of control,
Right.
unfortunately.
What
It's
if
being
you're-
abused.
What if your insurance company doesn't allow pit bulls?
Then you tell them that you will accept it but you have to have these guys
Yeah.
call your insurance company and tell them it's illegal for them to charge you more on your insurance. And good luck not getting dropped.
Right. So it would be an accommodation request to you as well as to the insurance provider.
And the city wasn't taking them, and these guys took on the cities, and now the cities have to take them. So that's not an issue anymore.
Actually, yeah, I think there was a law that
Yeah.
was just signed that eliminated breed restrictions
Yeah.
that the governor just signed.
That's a good question. So that person had to give some kind of information to you to verify that they had a disability, be it a social worker, doctor, whatever. would that person who provided that information that they had a verifiable disability, would you be able to get information that they had a verifiable disability and therefore they needed to have this assistant animal? And so, you know, because I've had, not in this setting, but in the school setting, people saying, well, my kid has to bring this animal to school because, you know, I mean, there was no verification that their disability required that they bring this chihuahua to school.
Yeah, and so that's what that verification is.
So you could connect that to the actual animal.
Yes. So,
Rather than having the person say, I need 5 chickens with me at
right.
that point.
So you have the right to ask for verification. So that person
Okay.
should go to a provider, like I said, someone who's familiar, write a letter on their behalf that says, I am this type of professional, I know this person, I'm attesting that they have a disability as defined by the Fair Housing Act. I'm also attesting that they need a dog or a snake. It should be specific to be able to use and enjoy their apartment. I mean, it's really simple. It doesn't get into the nature of their disability, but that person, as a professional, is saying, I know them, they have a disability, and yes, they need it. So you have a right to ask for one of those verification letters.
So can the companion animal have to have a companion animal?
A companion animal is not a protected class.
So when they need 2, you can draw the line.
The provider should, like I said, specify in a letter. There definitely are some situations where there might be more than one animal involved. We've seen people who have different disabilities and they have two dogs. We've also seen situations where there are children or multiple family members with disabilities, and so there might be multiple animals in situations like that. But when somebody's asking for, like you said, a companion animal for their companion animal, that is kind of getting too far off.
And if they're
What-
visiting with the companion animal, how does that work? Do you have to let them in? If they're visiting your complex, if you have a no pet policy, they have no documentation, you have no idea, do you have to let them in?
So it's a little bit different there, because if the person is not living there, then I'm not an attorney right now. The Fair Housing Act will cover the person who's living there. If somebody else is visiting and they have a service animal, I think that would be an ADA situation.
And that makes sense, but I'm talking
Yes.
companion animals.
And so if that person has a companion animal, I'm gonna say that's a real stretch for them to be able to take their animal with them. And, I mean, it's basically taking their animal into a public place, again, which is ADA. And ADA says it has to be a dog and it has to have training, so, yeah.
Which type of providers can give that type of a letter or certification?
You know, like I said, it can be a doctor, it can be a therapist, a social worker, caseworker. You know, there are some agencies that have like day centers for people with disabilities. So, you know, somebody's going there every day, they know that person. I think there should probably be a relationship between the person writing the letter and the person with the disability. Like me as a social worker, as a professional, I wouldn't feel comfortable with somebody just coming to me and me not knowing them and writing them a letter. And hopefully other professionals would be the same way, but that's not always the case.
But at what point do we say, you know what, I don't think that, you know, you have the knowledge to say yay or nay on this?
I
I mean, if it's a brother or a cousin.
Yeah, I mean, you
or-
can certainly investigate. If you have any questions, you can call us. We would be happy. We don't receive very many calls from landlords unless they're in trouble. And so, if you did have questions, we would actually really like to hear from you if you do have a situation. Because really, a lot of times, we don't interact with landlords unless they broken the law or they get caught doing something they're not supposed to be doing.
Well, as a landlord, you have the right to take that letter or whatever documentation and call up and
Yeah.
say, I've received this from so-and-so, I'd like to speak with so-and-so who signed his name on it.
Yeah, you
Just for
can,
verification.
you can verify that. You know, and somebody might have drafted a fake letter with a fake number and they might be trying to pass that off. So, yeah, you certainly can.
And also, if there's, say, 2 or 3 or 4 animals, you have the right to challenge that to that individual, do you
Yeah.
not?
Yeah.
So can you write the things that you can do that says require license, require owner to clean up into your late lease agreement?
Yeah, so, so landlords or property owners, we'll get this one out of the way first. You can't charge, and we kind of already talked about this, an additional deposit or additional rent if someone has an assistance animal. So if there's a no pets policy, I see your question.
Yes.
You have to allow it. If you do allow pets with a deposit and a monthly fee, you have to provide an exemption for that deposit if it's an assistance animal. You can require licensing and inoculations if state and local laws require that. You can require them to clean up after the animal, and you can require the animals under their control at all times. If the animal's behavior violates the term of the lease, you know, if it's out barking at people, if it's, you know, out pooping on the lawn and not cleaning up after it, and it's a health, you know, issue, you can address that with the tenant. And if they don't take responsibility, you can start giving lease violations that way. So that's kind of your recourse there. I've heard people talk about evicting the animal, and that's not really what happens. You do a lease violation, which could eventually lead to the tenant being evicted. So if they want to remedy the problem by getting rid of their animal, then that's up to them. So I know that
we'll close up and then we can continue questions informally. But the battery is dying, so I'm just gonna step up and say real quick.